In the year 978, when the great forests of the north whispered with ancient spirits and the Dnieper River carried the prayers of a newly Christian land, a child was born who would reshape the very foundations of Eastern Europe. The stone churches had not yet risen, the great law codes had not yet been written, and the royal marriage alliances that would bind Kyiv to Paris had not yet been conceived. But in that moment, as winter snow settled over the wooden walls of the emerging realm, destiny took human form in the person of Yaroslav, son of Vladimir, prince of a people caught between the dying echoes of paganism and the rising hymns of Byzantine Christianity. The world into which Yaroslav was born existed at the crossroads of civilizations, where the amber routes from the Baltic Sea intersected with the great river highways that led south to Constantinople and the glittering courts of the Byzantine Empire. Here, in the vast expanse of forest and steppe that would one day be called Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, the Slavic peoples had carved out settlements along riverbanks and clearings, their wooden fortresses rising like islands of human order in an ocean of wilderness. The air itself seemed to hum with possibility and danger, as Viking longships still occasionally appeared on the rivers, their dragon prows cutting through morning mists, while from the southern steppes came the distant thunder of nomadic horsemen whose allegiances shifted like the winds across the grasslands. Vladimir I, Yaroslav's father, had already begun the monumental task of binding these scattered tribes and settlements into something resembling a unified state. But it was a fragile unity, held together more by personal loyalty and the threat of external enemies than by any deep-rooted institutions or shared identity. The prince ruled from Kyiv, that ancient settlement perched on the high bluffs overlooking the Dnieper, where the golden domes of newly built churches caught the first light of dawn and reflected it across waters that had carried traders and warriors for countless generations. Yet even as Vladimir consolidated his power and embraced the Christian faith that would transform his realm, the very foundations of that power remained uncertain, dependent on the complex web of relationships between princes and boyars, between settled farmers and nomadic raiders, between the old gods of forest and field and the new god whose cross now topped the highest towers of Kyiv. Into this world of shifting allegiances and uncertain borders, Yaroslav emerged as one of many sons, for Vladimir's court was populated with the children of multiple wives and concubines, each representing different tribal alliances and political calculations. The practice of polygamy, inherited from the pagan past and only gradually giving way to Christian customs, meant that succession was never a simple matter of primogeniture. Instead, each prince's son could potentially claim a portion of the realm, and the division of territories among multiple heirs was both a source of strength, as it extended the ruling family's influence across vast distances, and a source of inevitable conflict, as brothers would eventually compete for supremacy. Yaroslav's earliest years were spent not in the grand halls of Kyiv, but in the quieter, more northern city of Rostov, where the young prince learned the fundamentals of leadership while surrounded by the vast forests and lakes of the Volga region. Here, the influence of Scandinavian culture remained strong, for the Rus princes traced their lineage back to the legendary Rurik, and many of the warrior bands that served the royal family still spoke Norse alongside Slavic tongues. The boy who would one day be called the Wise spent his childhood learning the arts of war and governance from men whose grandfathers had sailed the northern seas, and whose understanding of kingship blended Viking traditions of warrior leadership with the emerging Byzantine concepts of imperial authority. The daily rhythms of Yaroslav's youth were shaped by the seasonal cycles that governed all life in this northern realm. Summer brought the opportunity for long expeditions along the river routes, where the young prince would have learned to read the subtle signs of current and weather that could mean the difference between successful trade and disaster on the water. These journeys served multiple purposes, for they allowed the prince to establish personal relationships with local leaders, to observe the wealth and defenses of various settlements, and to understand the complex network of alliances and enmities that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. As the boats moved slowly southward, carried by the current and propelled by long sweeps when the wind failed, Yaroslav would have seen the gradual transition from the deep forests of the north to the more open country around Kyiv, where agriculture had begun to replace hunting and gathering as the primary means of subsistence. Winter brought different lessons, as the court settled into more permanent quarters and the focus shifted from travel and warfare to the internal business of governance. The long months of snow and cold provided opportunities for extended study, and it was during these quiet seasons that Yaroslav first encountered the books and manuscripts that would shape his later passion for learning and law. The prince's education included not only the martial skills expected of a medieval ruler, but also literacy in Church Slavonic, the sacred language that had been developed by the Byzantine missionaries Cyril and Methodius for the evangelization of Slavic peoples. This script, with its elegant curves and dignified proportions, opened the door to a vast library of religious and historical texts, many of them translations from Greek originals that preserved the wisdom of classical antiquity and the theological insights of the early church fathers. The young Yaroslav's temperament set him apart from many of his brothers and half-brothers, for while they showed greater inclination toward the traditional pursuits of hunting and raiding, he demonstrated an early fascination with the more contemplative aspects of leadership. This did not mean that he neglected military training, for no prince could survive in this harsh world without the ability to defend himself and command others in battle. But even his approach to warfare showed a preference for strategy over simple aggression, for careful planning over impulsive action. The boy who would later become renowned for his legal codes and his patronage of learning was already showing signs of the intellectual curiosity that would define his reign. The religious transformation of Vladimir's court provided another crucial element in Yaroslav's education, for the adoption of Christianity brought with it not only new spiritual practices but also new concepts of political authority and social organization. The young prince witnessed the construction of the first stone churches in Kyiv, including the Church of the Tithes, where Byzantine architects and craftsmen worked alongside local laborers to create buildings that embodied both the grandeur of imperial Constantinople and the distinctive needs of the northern climate. The slow, careful process of construction became a metaphor for the broader transformation of Rus society, as ancient customs and beliefs were gradually reshaped by Christian teachings and Byzantine political theory. As Yaroslav approached adulthood, his father Vladimir faced the delicate task of providing appropriate roles for his numerous sons while maintaining the unity of the realm. The traditional solution was to assign each prince to govern a specific city or region, where he would serve as his father's representative while gaining the experience necessary for eventual independent rule. This system, known as the ladder of succession, theoretically provided a clear path for advancement, as princes would move from smaller to larger cities as their older brothers died or were promoted. In practice, however, the system created as many problems as it solved, for ambitious princes were constantly tempted to expand their territories at the expense of their relatives, and the death of the senior prince invariably triggered a period of civil war as the surviving brothers fought to determine the new hierarchy. For Yaroslav, this system of delegated authority offered both opportunity and danger. Around the year 1010, when he was perhaps 32 years old, Vladimir assigned him to govern the great northern city of Novgorod, the ancient commercial center that controlled the trade routes connecting the Baltic Sea with the interior of the continent. This appointment represented both a mark of his father's confidence and a test of his abilities, for Novgorod was no ordinary provincial town but rather a wealthy and independent-minded community with its own traditions of self-governance and its own network of international connections. Novgorod in the early 11th century was a city unlike any other in the Slavic world, a place where the harsh realities of northern commerce had created a unique blend of monarchy and republicanism that would persist for centuries to come. The city's wealth derived from its position at the northern terminus of the great river highway that connected the Baltic with the Black Sea, a route that carried not only goods but also ideas, technologies, and cultural influences from across the known world. Amber from the shores of the Baltic Sea passed through Novgorod on its way to the luxury markets of Byzantium, while silks and spices from distant Asia traveled northward along the same routes, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that was rare in the medieval world. The physical layout of Novgorod reflected its commercial importance and its distinctive political culture. The city was divided into several distinct quarters, each with its own church, its own market, and its own traditions of local governance. The famous bridge over the Fokhof River served not only as a vital transportation link but also as a gathering place where citizens could debate public issues and where commercial disputes were settled according to ancient custom. The prince's palace, while certainly grand by the standards of the time, was notably less imposing than the royal residences of other medieval rulers. For in Novgorod, the prince was expected to govern in partnership with the city's merchants and craftsmen rather than simply dictating terms from above. Yaroslav's tenure in Novgorod provided him with invaluable experience in the arts of consensus building and compromise that would later serve him well as Grand Prince of Kyiv. The city's merchants were sophisticated negotiators who understood the complexities of international trade, and who expected their ruler to protect their interests while respecting their traditional freedoms. This meant that Yaroslav had to learn to balance the demands of his father's court in Kyiv with the expectations of his subjects in Novgorod, a delicate task that required both diplomatic skill and a deep understanding of the economic forces that drove the city's prosperity. The commercial life of Novgorod exposed Yaroslav to a wide range of foreign influences and ideas that would shape his later policies as Grand Prince. Merchants from Scandinavia brought news of political developments in the northern kingdoms, while traders from the Byzantine Empire carried reports of theological controversies and imperial policies that might affect the Orthodox churches of the Rus. German merchants from the emerging towns of the Holy Roman Empire introduced new techniques of craftsmanship and manufacturing, while travelers from the Islamic world brought knowledge of scientific and philosophical developments that had been largely unknown in Christian Europe. This constant flow of information and ideas made Novgorod a center of learning as well as commerce, and Yaroslav took full advantage of the opportunities it provided for intellectual growth. The city's libraries, while modest by Byzantine standards, contained collections of manuscripts that included not only religious texts but also works on history, law, and natural philosophy. The prince's personal study became a gathering place for scholars and scribes who shared his interest in preserving and expanding the written culture of the Slavic peoples. It was during his years in Novgorod that Yaroslav first began to envision the comprehensive legal code that would later become known as the Russkaya Pravda, a project that reflected both his scholarly inclinations and his practical experience in governing a complex commercial society. The political challenges of ruling Novgorod also provided Yaroslav with crucial lessons in the management of diverse and sometimes conflicting interests. The city's population included not only Slavic merchants and craftsmen but also Scandinavian traders, Byzantine diplomats, and representatives of various nomadic peoples who came to sell furs and other products of the northern forests. Each group had its own customs and expectations, and the successful ruler had to find ways to accommodate these differences while maintaining overall order and prosperity. This experience of governing a multicultural community would prove invaluable when Yaroslav later became responsible for the much larger and more diverse population of the entire Rus realm. The relationship between Novgorod and Kyiv was governed by a complex web of obligations and expectations that reflected the broader structure of medieval Rus society. As Prince of Novgorod, Yaroslav was expected to provide military protection for the city's trade routes and to represent its interests in dealings with foreign powers. In return, Novgorod was obligated to provide tribute to the Grand Prince in Kyiv and to contribute troops for major military campaigns. This system worked reasonably well as long as the interests of the two cities aligned, but it contained the seeds of future conflict, for the commercial priorities of Novgorod did not always coincide with the broader political goals of the royal court. The tensions inherent in this relationship became increasingly apparent as Vladimir aged and questions about succession began to dominate political discussions throughout the realm. Yaroslav's success in governing Novgorod had enhanced his reputation as a capable administrator, but it had also made him more independent and self-confident, qualities that could be either assets or liabilities depending on circumstances. The prince's growing interest in legal reform and educational development reflected his vision of a more sophisticated and centralized form of government, but such innovations required resources and authority that could only come from the Grand Prince himself. As the first decade of the new millennium drew to a close, the question of succession became increasingly urgent, for Vladimir was now well into his 50s and beginning to show signs of age and infirmity. The system of distributed princedoms that had served to maintain unity during the founder's lifetime threatened to become a source of division and conflict once he was no longer alive to arbitrate disputes between his sons. Each prince had developed his own power base, his own network of supporters, and his own vision of how the realm should be governed. The stage was being set for a struggle that would test not only the military capabilities of the various contenders, but also their political wisdom and their ability to inspire loyalty among the diverse peoples of the Rus. In Novgorod, Yaroslav could feel the approaching crisis like a storm gathering on the horizon. Messages from Kyiv arrived with increasing frequency, carrying news of his father's declining health and reports of growing tensions between various brothers and half-brothers. The prince found himself facing difficult choices about where his ultimate loyalties lay and how he should position himself for the uncertain times ahead. His experience in governing Novgorod had given him confidence in his own abilities, but it had also made him aware of how much he still had to learn about the broader challenges of ruling a medieval state. The winter of 1014 brought particularly ominous news from the south, as reports reached Novgorod that Vladimir's health was failing rapidly and that various princes were beginning to position themselves for the succession struggle that seemed increasingly inevitable. Yaroslav spent long hours in his private study, reading historical accounts of previous succession crises and consulting with advisors about the best course of action. The precedents were not encouraging, for the history of early medieval Europe was littered with examples of realms that had been torn apart by civil wars between rival claimants to the throne. But in Kyiv, his father Vladimir lay dying, and the realm would soon convulse with civil war that would test every lesson Yaroslav had learned during his years of preparation in the north. Phase 2. The struggle for power, 1015 to 1019. The death of Vladimir I in the summer of 1015 marked the end of an era and the beginning of one of the most brutal succession struggles in the history of medieval Europe. For nearly 3 decades, the Grand Prince had held together a vast and diverse realm through a combination of personal charisma, military prowess, and careful political maneuvering. His conversion to Christianity had provided a unifying ideology that transcended tribal boundaries, while his system of delegating authority to his sons had created a network of local administrators who were bound to the central government by ties of blood and loyalty. But death, that great leveler of human ambitions, rendered all these achievements suddenly fragile, as the carefully constructed political edifice began to crack under the pressure of competing claims and conflicting loyalties. The news of Vladimir's death reached different parts of the realm at different times and in different ways, creating a period of uncertainty and confusion that ambitious princes could exploit to their advantage. In some regions, local administrators simply continued to govern as they had before, waiting to see which claimant would emerge victorious before declaring their allegiance. In others, the announcement of the Grand Prince's death triggered immediate changes in policy and personnel, as various factions moved quickly to secure their positions for the coming struggle. The vast distances that separated the major cities of the realm meant that weeks or even months might pass before all the key players were fully informed about the situation. And this lag in communication created opportunities for deception and surprise that would play crucial roles in the unfolding drama. In Kyiv itself, the immediate aftermath of Vladimir's death was dominated by the ambitious machinations of Svatopluk, one of the deceased prince's sons whose mother had been a Greek nun and whose own temperament combined political cunning with a ruthless disregard for traditional moral constraints. Svatopluk had been governing the city of Turov at the time of his father's death, but he moved quickly to establish himself in the capital, claiming the authority of the Grand Prince and beginning to eliminate potential rivals with a systematic brutality that would earn him the epithet the Accursed in later chronicles. His immediate targets were his younger brothers Boris and Gleb, both of whom enjoyed considerable popularity among the boyars and the general population, and whose reputations for piety and justice made them dangerous rivals for the throne. The murders of Boris and Gleb, carried out by Svatopluk's agents in July and September of 1015, sent shockwaves throughout the Rus lands and established a pattern of violence that would characterize the entire succession struggle. Boris, who had been returning from a military expedition against the Pecheneg when he learned of his father's death, was ambushed and killed while praying in his tent on the banks of the Alta River. Gleb, who had been summoned to Kyiv under false pretenses, was murdered by his own cook while traveling by boat on the Dnieper River. Both brothers had apparently suspected their fate but had chosen not to resist, believing that civil war would cause more suffering than their own deaths. Their passive acceptance of martyrdom, while admirable from a Christian perspective, did nothing to prevent the very conflict they had hoped to avoid. The canonization of Boris and Gleb as the first native saints of the Russian Orthodox Church would later transform them into powerful symbols of Christian virtue and political legitimacy. But in the immediate aftermath of their deaths, their martyrdom served primarily to legitimize opposition to Svatopluk's rule. Throughout the realm, princes and boyars who might otherwise have been willing to accept the new Grand Prince found themselves morally obligated to resist a ruler who had gained power through fratricide. The very brutality that Svatopluk had hoped would eliminate opposition instead created a moral framework within which that opposition could organize and justify its actions. Far to the north in Novgorod, Yaroslav received news of these developments with a mixture of grief, anger, and cold calculation. The deaths of Boris and Gleb had eliminated 2 potential rivals, but they had also demonstrated the lengths to which Svatopluk was prepared to go in order to secure his position. The message was clear. Submission would offer no guarantee of safety, and neutrality was not an option in a struggle where the stakes were literally life and death. Yaroslav's years of governing Novgorod had taught him the importance of building coalitions and securing reliable sources of support, lessons that would now be tested under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The political situation facing Yaroslav in the autumn of 1015 was both dangerous and complex. His control over Novgorod provided him with a secure base of operations and access to the city's considerable financial resources, but it also isolated him from the main centers of political power in the south. The vast forests and marshlands that separated Novgorod from Kyiv offered protection against attack, but they also made it difficult to gather intelligence about his enemy's movements or to coordinate operations with potential allies. Most crucially, his distance from the heartland of the realm raised questions about his legitimacy as a claimant to the grand princely throne. For tradition suggested that the ruler of the Rus should govern from Kyiv, the mother of Russian cities, rather than from the commercial metropolis of the north. The military resources available to Yaroslav reflected both the strengths and the limitations of his position. Novgorod's wealth enabled him to hire mercenary warriors from Scandinavia, tough and experienced fighters whose loyalty could be purchased with silver and whose effectiveness in battle was legendary throughout the Baltic region. These Varangian warriors brought with them not only individual combat skills but also knowledge of advanced military techniques, including siege warfare and naval operations, that could prove crucial in the coming conflict. However, mercenary armies, no matter how skilled, lacked the deep emotional commitment that motivated troops fighting for their homeland or their prince, and their loyalty remained contingent on regular payment and successful outcomes. The diplomatic challenges facing Yaroslav were equally complex, for success in medieval warfare often depended as much on political alliances as on military strength. Throughout the winter of 1015 to 1016, emissaries traveled back and forth between Novgorod and various other centers of power, carrying offers of alliance, threats of retaliation, and attempts to gauge the intentions of uncommitted princes and boyars. These negotiations required careful attention to questions of precedence and protocol, for the medieval world operated according to elaborate codes of honor and status that could not be violated without serious consequences. A poorly worded message or an inappropriate gesture could transform a potential ally into an enemy, while a skillfully crafted diplomatic initiative could sometimes achieve more than a successful military campaign. The winter months also provided Yaroslav with crucial time to prepare for the military campaign that would determine his fate. The harsh climate of northern Russia, which had always been a barrier to large-scale military operations, now became an ally that protected Novgorod from immediate attack while allowing its ruler to build up his forces and refine his strategy. The city's workshops rang with the sound of weapons being forged and repaired, while its markets filled with supplies for the coming campaign. Training camps established in the surrounding countryside allowed Yaroslav's growing army to practice the complex maneuvers that would be necessary for success against Svatopluk's more numerous but less disciplined forces. The psychological aspects of the preparation were as important as the physical ones, for Yaroslav understood that victory would depend not only on tactical skill but also on the ability to inspire confidence and loyalty among his followers. The prince spent long hours with his senior commanders, discussing strategy and building the personal relationships that would hold his army together under the pressures of combat. He also devoted considerable attention to the religious dimensions of the coming conflict, working with church officials to frame the struggle in terms that would resonate with Christian audiences throughout the realm. The martyrdom of Boris and Gleb provided a powerful narrative framework within which Yaroslav could present himself as an agent of divine justice seeking to punish fraternal murder and restore righteous government. As spring arrived in 1016, bringing with it the resumption of active campaigning, Yaroslav faced the crucial decision of when and where to strike against his brother. Military wisdom suggested that he should move quickly before Svatopluk could consolidate his position, but political considerations argued for a more cautious approach that would allow time for additional allies to declare themselves and for public opinion to solidify against the fratricidal usurper. The prince ultimately chose a middle course, launching his campaign early enough to maintain momentum but late enough to ensure that his forces were properly prepared and his political position was as strong as possible. The army that marched south from Novgorod in the late spring of 1016 represented a remarkable synthesis of different military traditions and cultural influences. At its core were the Druzina, the professional warriors who formed the backbone of any medieval Rus army. Men who had dedicated their lives to the service of their prince and who could be counted on to fight with skill and determination under the most difficult circumstances. These native warriors were supplemented by Varangian mercenaries whose presence added both tactical flexibility and psychological intimidation, for their reputation for ferocity in battle was known throughout the medieval world. Supporting these combat troops were the various specialists necessary for a major military campaign. Engineers capable of constructing siege equipment, scouts familiar with the terrain between Novgorod and Kyiv, and administrators responsible for maintaining supply lines and coordinating logistics. The march southward provided Yaroslav with his first real test as a military commander. For the successful movement of a large army across difficult terrain required skills that differed significantly from those needed for governing a city or conducting diplomatic negotiations. The prince had to balance the need for speed against the importance of maintaining discipline and cohesion, while constantly evaluating intelligence reports about enemy movements and adjusting his route accordingly. The challenges were compounded by the need to maintain the loyalty and morale of a diverse force that included men from different cultural backgrounds and with different motivations for participating in the campaign. As Yaroslav's army moved through the forest pathways and river valleys that connected Novgorod with the southern heartland, news of their approach spread throughout the realm, triggering a complex series of political realignments that would ultimately determine the outcome of the conflict. Some princes and boyars who had initially accepted Svatopluk's authority began to reconsider their positions, calculating that Yaroslav's growing momentum might make him a safer bet for long-term survival. Others doubled down on their support for the incumbent, reasoning that a successful defense against the northern challenger would eliminate a dangerous rival and stabilize the political situation. These shifting loyalties created opportunities for both sides but also introduced elements of uncertainty that made strategic planning extremely difficult. The first major engagement between the opposing forces occurred near the town of Lyabek in the early summer of 1016, when advance elements of Yaroslav's army encountered a detachment of troops loyal to Svatopluk. The battle itself was relatively small by the standards of medieval warfare, involving perhaps a few hundred men on each side, but its psychological impact was enormous. Yaroslav's forces achieved a clear victory, capturing several prominent enemies and seizing a substantial quantity of supplies and equipment. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that Svatopluk's army was not invincible and that the northern challenger possessed both the military skills and the political support necessary to mount a serious campaign for the throne. News of the victory at Lyabek spread rapidly throughout the realm, triggering a cascade of defections from Svatopluk's cause and reinforcing the growing perception that divine providence favored Yaroslav's claim to the throne. Medieval warfare was as much about perceptions and morale as about tactical superiority, and a reputation for success could become a self-fulfilling prophecy as wavering supporters rushed to join what appeared to be the winning side. Svatopluk found himself facing not only military defeat but also political isolation, as former allies began to distance themselves from a cause that no longer seemed likely to succeed. The decisive confrontation between the two brothers came in the late autumn of 1016, when their armies finally met in a large-scale battle near the town of Lyabek. The engagement began before dawn with a series of probing attacks designed to test the enemy's dispositions and identify weaknesses in their defensive positions. As the sun rose over the battlefield, revealing the full extent of both armies, it became clear that this would be no minor skirmish, but rather a major battle that would determine the immediate future of the Rus realm. Thousands of warriors faced each other across a field that would soon be soaked with blood, their weapons glinting in the morning light as commanders made final adjustments to their battle plans. Yaroslav's tactical approach reflected both his careful study of military history and his practical experience of Novgorod's commercial and political culture. Rather than relying solely on the traditional Rus tactics of mounted charges and individual combat, he deployed his forces in a more systematic manner that took advantage of his army's diverse capabilities. The Varangian mercenaries, with their superior armor and weapons, formed the center of his battle line, providing a solid anchor around which the rest of his forces could maneuver. Native cavalry units were positioned on the flanks, where their mobility could be used to exploit any weaknesses in the enemy formation, while archers and other missile troops were placed in positions where they could provide supporting fire without interfering with the movements of the main combat units. Svatopluk's army, while larger than Yaroslav's force, suffered from several crucial disadvantages that would ultimately prove decisive. Many of his troops were recent recruits whose loyalty was questionable and whose training was inadequate for the demands of a major battle. The political circumstances of his rise to power had also limited his ability to attract experienced commanders, for many of the realm's most capable military leaders had been alienated by his brutal treatment of Boris and Gleb. Most importantly, the moral dimensions of the conflict had created a situation where many of Svatopluk's followers were fighting more from fear than from conviction, a psychological disadvantage that became increasingly apparent as the battle developed. The fighting itself was brutal and chaotic, as medieval battles inevitably were, with individual acts of heroism and cowardice occurring within a larger framework of tactical maneuvering and strategic calculation. For several hours, the outcome remained uncertain, with both armies achieving local successes that raised hopes of overall victory. Yaroslav himself fought in the front ranks, following the traditional expectation that a prince should share the dangers faced by his followers, and his personal courage helped to maintain the morale of his troops during the most difficult phases of the engagement. Several times during the battle, the prince was nearly surrounded by enemy warriors, and only the intervention of his personal guard prevented his capture or death. The turning point came in the late afternoon, when a coordinated attack by Yaroslav's cavalry units succeeded in breaking through Svatopluk's left flank and threatening the rear of his main battle line. The psychological impact of this breakthrough was even more significant than its tactical consequences, for it demonstrated to wavering elements within Svatopluk's army that their cause was lost and that continued resistance would only result in unnecessary casualties. What had begun as an orderly withdrawal quickly degenerated into a rout, with individual units and commanders seeking to save themselves rather than continuing to fight for their increasingly desperate leader. Svatopluk himself managed to escape from the battlefield, but his army had been effectively destroyed and his political position was now untenable. The victory established Yaroslav as the dominant force in the realm, but it did not immediately end the civil war, for Svatopluk retained control of Kyiv and could still call upon the support of various allies and mercenary forces. The challenge now facing the victorious prince was to transform his military success into lasting political control, a task that would require not only continued battlefield effectiveness but also the diplomatic skills necessary to reconcile former enemies and rebuild the damaged institutions of government. The months following the battle near Lyabek were marked by a series of smaller engagements and political negotiations as Yaroslav gradually tightened his control over the countryside surrounding Kyiv. His strategy during this period demonstrated the tactical flexibility and political sophistication that would characterize his later reign as Grand Prince. Rather than attempting to storm the heavily fortified capital immediately, he chose to isolate it through a combination of military pressure and economic blockade, cutting off the supply routes that connected the city with its agricultural hinterland and gradually undermining Svatopluk's ability to maintain his remaining forces. This methodical approach required considerable patience and discipline, for many of Yaroslav's followers were eager to press their advantage and complete their victory as quickly as possible. The prince understood, however, that a premature assault on Kyiv would likely result in heavy casualties and might damage the very city that he hoped to rule. More importantly, the prolonged siege provided opportunities for additional political negotiations that could potentially end the conflict without further bloodshed, an outcome that would serve Yaroslav's long-term interests by reducing the bitterness and resentment that might otherwise complicate his future governance. The final phase of the civil war began in the early spring of 1019, when Yaroslav learned that Svatopluk had succeeded in hiring a large force of Pecheneg mercenaries and was preparing for a desperate final gamble to break the siege of Kyiv and regain the initiative in the conflict. The Pecheneg were a nomadic people whose homeland lay in the steppes north of the Black Sea, and their cavalry-based military system made them formidable opponents in open warfare. Their decision to support Svatopluk was motivated primarily by the promise of substantial payment and the prospect of plunder, but their intervention introduced a dangerous new element into the conflict that threatened to transform a civil war between Christian princes into a broader struggle between settled and nomadic peoples. The battle that finally ended the civil war took place on the banks of the Alta River in July 1019, at almost exactly the same location where Boris had been murdered 4 years earlier. This geographical coincidence was not lost on contemporaries, who interpreted it as a sign of divine justice and a fulfillment of the martyred prince's prophecy that his blood would eventually be avenged. The symbolic dimensions of the battle were reinforced by its timing, for it occurred during the period of summer fasting when Christian warriors traditionally sought spiritual purification before engaging in combat. Yaroslav's tactical approach to the battle reflected his growing confidence and his improved understanding of his enemy's capabilities and limitations. He deployed his forces in a defensive formation that took advantage of the terrain while minimizing the mobility advantages typically enjoyed by nomadic cavalry. The Varangian mercenaries and native infantry formed a solid battle line anchored on natural obstacles, while the Rus cavalry was held in reserve for use at the decisive moment. Most importantly, Yaroslav had learned to coordinate the different elements of his army more effectively, using archers and other missile troops to disrupt enemy formations before committing his heavy infantry to close combat. The battle itself was relatively brief but decisive, with Svatopluk's forces suffering a crushing defeat that effectively ended their ability to continue organized resistance. The Pecheneg allies, whose commitment to the cause had always been questionable, were among the first to flee when the tide of battle turned against them. Svatopluk himself was killed during the fighting, though the exact circumstances of his death remained a matter of controversy among chroniclers. Some accounts suggested that he died in single combat with his brother, while others claimed that he was struck down by an anonymous warrior or killed while attempting to flee the battlefield. The victory at Alta River established Yaroslav as the undisputed ruler of the Rus realm, but it also marked the beginning of an even greater challenge: the task of rebuilding a state that had been devastated by 4 years of civil war. Entire regions had been depopulated by the fighting, while trade networks that had taken decades to develop had been disrupted or destroyed entirely. Many of the realm's most experienced administrators and military commanders had been killed during the conflict, creating a leadership vacuum that would take years to fill. Most importantly, the brutality and bitterness of the civil war had left deep scars in the political culture that would influence Rus history for generations to come. But as Yaroslav rode through the gates of Kyiv in triumph, accepting the homage of boyars and citizens who had survived the long nightmare of fraternal conflict, he carried with him not only the burden of victory but also a vision of what the realm might become under wise and peaceful leadership. The sword had made him prince, but wisdom would make him ruler of a state that would become a beacon of learning and justice in the medieval world. Phase 3. The Golden Age, Building the Realm, 1019 to 1037. The Kyiv that welcomed Yaroslav as its new Grand Prince in the summer of 1019 bore little resemblance to the glorious capital that would emerge over the following 2 decades. The years of civil war had left their mark on every aspect of the city's life, from the damaged fortifications that surrounded its core to the half-empty markets where merchants had once gathered from across the known world. Many of the wooden buildings within the city walls showed signs of fire damage, while others had simply been abandoned as their owners fled the violence or fell victim to the brutal factional fighting that had characterized Svatopluk's brief and blood-soaked reign. The great churches built by Vladimir I still stood, but their congregations had dwindled, and the elaborate court ceremonies that had once demonstrated the realm's growing sophistication had given way to the grim necessities of military survival. Yet even amid this devastation, Yaroslav could perceive the foundations upon which a greater city might be built. The natural advantages that had originally drawn settlers to this site remained unchanged. The commanding position on the high bluffs overlooking the Dnieper River, the convergence of multiple trade routes that connected the Baltic Sea with the Black Sea and the Mediterranean beyond, and the rich agricultural lands of the surrounding countryside that could support a substantial urban population. More importantly, the human resources necessary for reconstruction were still available. For while the Civil War had certainly taken its toll, it had not fundamentally altered the demographic and economic structures that had made Kyiv the premier city of the Eastern Slavic world. The first months of Yaroslav's reign were necessarily devoted to the immediate tasks of political consolidation and military security. Former supporters of Svatopluk had to be either reconciled or eliminated, while the various princes and boyars who had supported the victor needed to be rewarded for their loyalty without creating new sources of conflict or jealousy. The delicate process of redistributing lands and positions required all of Yaroslav's diplomatic skills, for medieval politics operated according to complex codes of honor and precedence that could not be ignored without serious consequences. A slight to one family or faction might create resentments that would fester for generations, while excessive generosity to particular groups could breed envy among those who felt themselves equally deserving of royal favor. The administrative challenges facing the new Grand Prince were compounded by the need to rebuild the governmental institutions that had been disrupted or destroyed during the Civil War. The elaborate system of tribute collection that had funded Vladimir's court and military forces had largely collapsed, as local administrators had either been killed in the fighting or had simply ceased to forward revenues to a capital whose political future remained uncertain. Trade networks that had connected Kyiv with distant markets had been severed by the breakdown of security along the major rivers, while the diplomatic relationships that had enabled the realm to maintain its position in the broader European political system had been neglected during the years of internal conflict. Yaroslav's approach to these challenges reflected both the practical lessons he had learned during his years governing Novgorod and his broader vision of what medieval kingship might accomplish under the right circumstances. Rather than simply attempting to restore the old system exactly as it had existed under his father, he began to introduce innovations that would ultimately transform the nature of government in the Rus lands. These changes were implemented gradually and carefully, for the prince understood that rapid reforms might alienate traditional supporters while creating new opportunities for his remaining enemies to exploit popular discontent. The rebuilding of Kyiv's physical infrastructure provided the most visible symbol of the realm's recovery and the new ruler's ambitions. Construction projects launched during the early years of Yaroslav's reign focused initially on practical necessities: the repair of the city's walls and gates, the restoration of damaged residential and commercial buildings, and the improvement of the water supply and waste disposal systems that were essential for supporting a large urban population. These mundane but crucial projects demonstrated the prince's attention to the everyday needs of his subjects, while providing employment for the craftsmen and laborers whose livelihoods had been disrupted by the recent conflicts. As the city's basic infrastructure was restored and its population began to recover, Yaroslav turned his attention to more ambitious construction projects that would serve both practical and symbolic purposes. The decision to build new churches and other religious structures reflected not only the prince's personal piety, but also his understanding of architecture as a tool of political communication. In an age when most people were illiterate and when visual symbols carried enormous emotional weight, the design and decoration of major buildings could convey messages about royal authority, religious orthodoxy, and cultural sophistication that would be understood by audiences ranging from foreign diplomats to local peasants. The planning and construction of these architectural projects required a level of organizational sophistication that had been largely absent from earlier Rus building efforts. Teams of architects and engineers had to be assembled from various sources, including the Byzantine Empire, where the most advanced construction techniques were available, and Western Europe, where different but equally valuable traditions of monumental building had developed. Skilled craftsmen specializing in stone carving, metalwork, and decorative painting had to be recruited and transported to Kyiv, often from great distances and at considerable expense. Most importantly, the massive quantities of raw materials required for major construction projects had to be procured, processed, and delivered to the building sites according to carefully coordinated schedules that took into account the seasonal rhythms of medieval life. The establishment of workshops and training programs designed to develop local expertise in advanced construction techniques represented one of Yaroslav's most far-sighted investments in the realm's long-term development. Rather than simply importing foreign craftsmen to complete specific projects, the prince created institutional frameworks that would enable the systematic transfer of knowledge and skills to native workers. Young men from Kyiv and the surrounding regions were apprenticed to master builders from Byzantium and other centers of architectural excellence, gradually acquiring the technical knowledge and artistic sensibilities necessary for independent work on major projects. These training programs created a new class of skilled professionals whose expertise would be available for future construction projects, while also establishing Kyiv as a center of architectural innovation that could compete with the greatest cities of the medieval world. The economic implications of these construction programs extended far beyond their immediate impact on employment and skills development. Major building projects required the development of sophisticated supply networks that connected Kyiv with quarries, forests, and metalworking centers located throughout the realm and beyond. The transportation of heavy materials over long distances necessitated improvements in roads, bridges, and river navigation that benefited commercial traffic generally. Perhaps most importantly, the prince's willingness to invest substantial resources in long-term construction projects sent a powerful signal to merchants and investors that the political situation had stabilized and that Kyiv was once again a safe and profitable place to do business. The religious dimensions of Yaroslav's building program reflected both his personal devotion and his sophisticated understanding of the political functions served by ecclesiastical architecture in medieval society. The construction of new churches provided focal points for community identity while demonstrating the ruler's commitment to Orthodox Christianity. The elaborate decoration of these buildings with frescoes, mosaics, and other artistic works created opportunities for theological education and spiritual inspiration that were particularly important in a society where most people could not read. Most significantly, the architectural styles and decorative programs chosen for major religious buildings established visual connections with the Byzantine Empire and other centers of Orthodox culture, reinforcing Kyiv's position as a legitimate member of the broader Christian Commonwealth. The culminating achievement of this construction program was the Cathedral of St. Sophia, begun around 1037 and representing one of the most ambitious architectural projects undertaken anywhere in Europe during the 11th century. The decision to build this massive structure reflected Yaroslav's growing confidence in his realm's stability and prosperity, for cathedrals of this scale required not only enormous initial investments but also substantial ongoing expenses for maintenance and liturgical functions. The building's design drew inspiration from the Great Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, but it was adapted to local conditions and preferences in ways that created a distinctively Rus architectural tradition. The physical dimensions of St. Sophia were calculated to inspire awe and demonstrate the power and wealth of its royal patron. The central nave rose to a height of nearly 30 meters, while the overall length of the building exceeded 50 meters, creating interior spaces of unprecedented grandeur in the context of Eastern European architecture. The structure's 13 domes, arranged according to a complex symbolic program that reflected contemporary theological understanding, created a distinctive silhouette that could be seen from great distances across the relatively flat landscape surrounding Kyiv. The building's exterior walls, constructed from local brick and stone but decorated with imported marble and other luxury materials, established new standards of architectural sophistication while demonstrating the international connections that had made such construction possible. The interior decoration of St. Sophia represented an even more remarkable achievement, combining the highest levels of artistic excellence with theological sophistication and political symbolism. The vast surfaces of walls and ceilings provided space for an elaborate program of frescoes and mosaics that told the story of Christian salvation while celebrating the achievements of the Rus dynasty. Master artists recruited from Constantinople worked alongside local craftsmen to create visual narratives that were both spiritually inspiring and politically instructive. The central dome featured a magnificent representation of Christ Pantocrator, the ruler of all creation, while the walls of the nave depicted scenes from the life of Jesus and the history of the early church. The iconographic program of St. Sophia also included significant secular elements that reflected the building's function as a royal chapel and ceremonial center. Portraits of the royal family appeared in prominent locations, while historical scenes depicted the conversion of Vladimir I and other crucial events in the development of Rus Christianity. These secular decorations served to legitimize Yaroslav's authority by placing it within a broader historical narrative that connected the contemporary ruler with his illustrious predecessors and with the divine source of all legitimate power. The integration of religious and political themes in a single decorative program demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of visual communication that characterized the cultural achievement of Yaroslav's court. The construction and decoration of St. Sophia required the development of new administrative systems for managing complex projects that involved multiple specialized crafts and substantial financial resources. The prince established a special bureau responsible for overseeing cathedral construction, staffed by administrators who possessed both technical knowledge and financial expertise. This organization maintained detailed records of expenditures, schedules, and personnel assignments that provided models for later administrative innovations. The successful completion of such a massive project demonstrated the effectiveness of these new management techniques, while establishing precedents for future governmental activities that would extend far beyond the realm of construction. Parallel to these architectural achievements, Yaroslav devoted substantial attention to the development of educational institutions that would provide the intellectual foundation for his vision of enlightened monarchy. The establishment of schools and libraries represented a conscious attempt to create a learned class of administrators and clergy, who could support more sophisticated forms of government and religious practice. These educational innovations built upon foundations laid during Vladimir I's reign, but they extended far beyond the basic literacy training that had characterized earlier efforts. The curriculum developed for these schools reflected both traditional Christian educational priorities and the practical needs of a medieval state. Students received thorough grounding in Church Slavonic literacy and religious texts, enabling them to participate effectively in liturgical services and theological discussions. But they also studied arithmetic, geometry, and other mathematical subjects that were essential for tax collection, construction projects, and commercial regulation. Historical studies provided knowledge of legal precedents and diplomatic protocols, while instruction in rhetoric and logic prepared future administrators for the complex negotiations that characterized medieval politics. The establishment of a major library within the cathedral complex represented one of Yaroslav's most visionary cultural initiatives. This collection, which eventually included hundreds of manuscripts copied from originals located in Constantinople, Rome, and other centers of learning, made advanced theological and historical texts available to scholars working in Kyiv. The library's holdings included not only religious works but also treatises on law, medicine, natural philosophy, and other subjects that were rarely available in vernacular translations. The presence of such a collection attracted scholars from throughout the Orthodox world while establishing Kyiv as a center of intellectual activity that could compete with the greatest libraries of the medieval period. The copying and illumination of manuscripts required the development of sophisticated scriptoriums staffed by scribes who possessed not only excellent penmanship but also knowledge of multiple languages and writing systems. The prince established workshops where young men could learn the demanding arts of manuscript production while also acquiring the broader education necessary for administrative or ecclesiastical careers. These scriptoriums produced not only copies of existing works but also original compositions that reflected the distinctive intellectual culture emerging within Yaroslav's court. Chronicles, legal texts, and theological treatises composed during this period established literary traditions that would influence Rus culture for centuries to come. The most enduring intellectual achievement of Yaroslav's reign was the compilation and promulgation of the Russkaya Pravda, a comprehensive legal code that represented the first systematic attempt to create unified legal standards for the diverse populations of the Rus realm. This remarkable document reflected not only the prince's scholarly interests but also his practical experience of governance and his understanding of law as a tool for social engineering. The legal principles embodied in the Russkaya Pravda drew upon multiple sources, including Byzantine legal traditions, Scandinavian customary law, and the practical judicial experience accumulated during Yaroslav's years governing Novgorod. The structure and content of the Russkaya Pravda demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the relationship between law and social order. The code addressed a wide range of legal issues, from criminal penalties and civil procedures to commercial regulations and family law. Its provisions reflected careful attention to the diverse social and economic conditions that existed within the realm, with different penalties and procedures established for different social classes and economic circumstances. The code's emphasis on monetary compensation rather than physical punishment for most offenses reflected both Christian moral teachings and practical considerations about maintaining social stability in a diverse and potentially fractious society. The implementation of the Russkaya Pravda required the development of new judicial institutions and procedures that would ensure consistent application of legal standards throughout the realm. Yaroslav established a network of courts staffed by trained legal professionals who possessed both knowledge of the written law and practical experience in dispute resolution. These judicial innovations represented a significant departure from earlier Rus legal practice, which had relied primarily on customary procedures and the personal judgment of individual princes or their representatives. The new system provided greater predictability and fairness in legal proceedings while also strengthening the central government's authority over local affairs. The economic policies implemented during Yaroslav's reign reflected his understanding of commerce and craftsmanship as foundations for political stability and cultural achievement. The prince actively encouraged trade by improving transportation infrastructure, standardizing weights and measures, and providing security for merchant caravans traveling along the major river routes. Special privileges were granted to foreign merchants who established permanent operations in Kyiv, while native traders received support for expanding their activities into new markets. These commercial policies generated substantial tax revenues that funded construction projects and administrative innovations, while also creating a prosperous middle class whose interests were closely aligned with the continued stability of the central government. The development of craft industries within Kyiv and other major cities reflected both the growing sophistication of consumer demand and the availability of skilled workers trained in advanced techniques. Royal workshops established under Yaroslav's patronage produced luxury goods that met the highest international standards while also serving as training centers where traditional crafts could be preserved and enhanced. The integration of native traditions with foreign innovations created distinctively Rus artistic styles that were recognized and admired throughout the medieval world. These artistic achievements provided tangible evidence of the realm's cultural sophistication, while also generating export revenues that contributed to the general prosperity of the period. The agricultural policies of Yaroslav's government reflected his understanding of farming as the fundamental economic activity that supported all other aspects of medieval society. The prince implemented programs designed to increase food production through the expansion of cultivated areas and the improvement of farming techniques. New settlements were established in previously undeveloped regions, while existing communities received support for improving their irrigation systems and agricultural tools. These initiatives required substantial government investment and careful coordination, but they generated increased tax revenues and population growth that strengthened the realm's overall capacity for military and cultural achievements. The military policies pursued during the peaceful period of Yaroslav's reign focused on maintaining defensive capabilities while avoiding the aggressive expansionism that had characterized earlier periods of Rus history. The prince understood that military strength remained essential for protecting the realm's borders and maintaining internal security, but he also recognized that excessive military spending could undermine the economic prosperity that made cultural achievements possible. His approach emphasized the development of professional military units that could respond effectively to external threats while also serving as a source of internal stability and a symbol of royal authority. The diplomatic initiatives undertaken during this period reflected Yaroslav's vision of the Rus realm as a legitimate member of the broader European political community. Embassies were exchanged with the Byzantine Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and other major powers, establishing relationships that would prove crucial for maintaining peace and promoting commercial development. These diplomatic contacts also facilitated cultural exchanges that enriched the intellectual life of Kyiv, while demonstrating the realm's growing sophistication to foreign observers. The prince's reputation for wisdom and justice spread throughout the medieval world, attracting scholars, artists, and craftsmen who contributed to the cultural flowering that characterized his reign. As the decade of the 1030s drew to a close, the transformation of Kyiv from a war-damaged provincial capital into one of Europe's most magnificent cities was approaching completion. The great cathedral of St. Sophia dominated the city's skyline, its golden domes catching the light of sunrise and sunset in displays of splendor that could be seen for miles across the surrounding countryside. The schools and libraries established under royal patronage had begun to produce a new generation of educated administrators and clergy whose knowledge and skills exceeded anything previously available in the region. The legal and administrative innovations of the period had created governmental institutions that provided justice and security for all classes of society, while maintaining the central authority necessary for continued stability and growth. But even as Yaroslav savored these remarkable achievements, his attention was beginning to turn toward an even more ambitious project: the establishment of diplomatic relationships that would connect his realm not merely with neighboring powers but with the royal courts of distant kingdoms across Europe. He built not for war, but for time, and now that time had come to extend the reach of Rus influence through the ancient arts of marriage diplomacy and dynastic alliance. Phase 4. The European Diplomat, Father-in-law of Europe, 1037 to 1050. The transformation of Yaroslav from a regional prince struggling for survival into one of medieval Europe's most sought-after diplomatic partners represented one of the most remarkable political achievements of the 11th century. By the late 1030s, the Grand Prince of Kyiv had established his realm as a major power whose friendship was courted by emperors and kings across the continent, from the Byzantine Basilius in Constantinople to the Holy Roman Emperor in Germany, from the kings of France and Hungary to the Jarls of Norway and Sweden. This diplomatic revolution reflected not only Yaroslav's personal skills as a negotiator and strategist, but also the fundamental transformation of the Rus realm from a collection of loosely connected principalities into a unified state capable of projecting power and influence far beyond its traditional borders. The foundation of Yaroslav's diplomatic success lay in his understanding of marriage as the most powerful and enduring form of international alliance available to medieval rulers. In an age when personal relationships between monarchs determined the fate of nations, and when written treaties were often meaningless without the bonds of kinship to enforce them, the strategic placement of royal daughters and sons could create networks of mutual obligation that transcended immediate political interests. Yaroslav possessed a remarkable asset for this diplomatic game: a large family of intelligent and attractive children whose marriages could serve as the building blocks for a comprehensive system of international relationships. The planning and execution of these marriage alliances required extraordinary sophistication in both intelligence gathering and strategic thinking. Yaroslav's court maintained detailed information about the political situations in courts across Europe, tracking succession disputes, alliance patterns, and the personal characteristics of potential marriage partners. This intelligence network relied on merchants, pilgrims, and diplomatic envoys who traveled regularly between Kyiv and distant capitals, bringing back reports about political developments that might create opportunities for advantageous marriage negotiations. The prince's personal involvement in evaluating this information and developing appropriate strategies demonstrated his recognition that diplomatic success required the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his military and administrative achievements. The most spectacular and historically significant of these marriage alliances was the union between Yaroslav's daughter Anna and Henry I, King of France, negotiated and concluded in the early 1050s. This remarkable diplomatic coup connected the Rus royal family with the Kyivan dynasty that would rule France for centuries to come, while establishing Kyiv as a player in the complex political relationships that determined the balance of power in Western Europe. The negotiations leading to this marriage revealed both the sophistication of medieval diplomacy and the growing reputation for wisdom and reliability that Yaroslav had acquired among his royal contemporaries. The French court's decision to seek a marriage alliance with Kyiv reflected the changing political circumstances of mid-11th century Europe and the growing recognition of the Rus realm as a legitimate and powerful member of the international community. King Henry I, faced with various domestic and external challenges to his authority, needed allies who could provide both military support and political legitimacy for his dynasty. The wealth and stability of Yaroslav's realm, combined with the Grand Prince's reputation for honor and reliability, made an alliance with Kyiv attractive from multiple perspectives. Moreover, the exotic appeal of a princess from the distant and mysterious land of the Rus added an element of romantic adventure to what was fundamentally a hard-headed political calculation. The journey of Anna Yaroslavna from Kyiv to Paris represented one of the most remarkable diplomatic expeditions of the medieval period, involving months of travel across the full breadth of Europe and requiring elaborate preparations that demonstrated the international reach of Yaroslav's diplomatic network. The princess traveled with a magnificent retinue that included not only personal servants and religious advisors but also craftsmen, scholars, and artists who would introduce French court society to the sophisticated culture that had developed in Kyiv under her father's patronage. The books, jewelry, religious artifacts, and other luxury goods that accompanied Anna to France provided tangible evidence of the Rus realm's wealth and cultural achievement, while establishing personal relationships that would facilitate future diplomatic and commercial exchanges. The reception of Anna Yaroslavna at the French court revealed the profound impact that Yaroslav's diplomatic initiatives were having on European perceptions of the Rus realm. Contemporary chronicles describe the astonishment of French courtiers at the princess's education and sophistication, for Anna possessed literacy in multiple languages and knowledge of subjects that were rarely studied by women of her era. Her personal library, transported from Kyiv at enormous expense, included manuscripts that were unknown in Western Europe and that demonstrated the advanced state of learning in her father's realm. The wedding ceremony itself, conducted according to both Latin and Orthodox rites, symbolized the bridging of religious and cultural differences that characterized the diplomatic vision underlying the alliance. The successful integration of Anna into French court society and her subsequent influence on French political and cultural development provided ongoing benefits for Yaroslav's diplomatic position throughout Europe. The princess's letters home, carried by the same merchant and diplomatic networks that had facilitated the original marriage negotiations, kept her father informed about political developments in France while also serving as vehicles for continued diplomatic communication between the two courts. Anna's reputation for wisdom and piety enhanced the prestige of her natal family, while creating opportunities for further diplomatic initiatives that built upon the foundation established by her marriage. Simultaneously with these negotiations with France, Yaroslav was pursuing equally ambitious marriage alliances with other major European powers, creating a web of relationships that would establish his family at the center of continental politics for generations to come. The marriage of his daughter Elizabeth to Harald Hardrada, later King Harald III of Norway, connected the Rus dynasty with the Scandinavian royal families from which it had originally descended, while also providing access to the extensive trade networks that linked the Baltic and North Seas with the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. This alliance proved particularly valuable for maintaining Kyiv's position in the lucrative amber and fur trades that formed the backbone of the realm's international commerce. The negotiations surrounding Elizabeth's marriage revealed the complexity of medieval diplomatic protocol and the importance of symbolic gestures in establishing and maintaining international relationships. Harold's reputation as one of the greatest warriors of his generation made him an attractive alliance partner from a military perspective, but his previous service in the Byzantine Varangian Guard also created potential complications for Yaroslav's relationship with Constantinople. The successful resolution of these diplomatic challenges required careful attention to questions of precedence and protocol that demonstrated the sophistication of the Rus court's understanding of international relations. The marriage alliance with Hungary, achieved through the union of Yaroslav's daughter Anastasia with King Andrew I, reflected the Grand Prince's recognition that the Rus realm's strategic position in Eastern Europe required careful management of relationships with all neighboring powers. Hungary's location at the crossroads between Western and Eastern Europe made it a crucial ally for any power seeking to maintain influence in the Danube region. While the kingdom's growing strength under the Arpad dynasty created both opportunities and potential threats for Rus interests, the marriage negotiations required delicate balancing of competing claims and interests, but their successful conclusion established a framework for cooperation that would benefit both realms for decades to come. The diplomatic protocols developed for managing these multiple marriage alliances demonstrated Yaroslav's understanding of international relations as a complex system requiring constant attention and careful cultivation. The Grand Prince established specialized administrative units within his court responsible for maintaining communication with each of the royal courts connected to Kyiv through marriage alliances. These diplomatic bureaus maintained detailed records of political developments in allied kingdoms, while also coordinating the exchange of gifts, letters, and other forms of ongoing communication that were essential for preserving good relationships between royal families. The economic dimensions of these diplomatic initiatives were as important as their political aspects, for marriage alliances created opportunities for expanded trade relationships that benefited all participating parties. The dowries and bride gifts exchanged during marriage negotiations often included not only precious metals and luxury goods, but also commercial privileges and trading rights that facilitated ongoing economic cooperation. Yaroslav's recognition of commerce as both a source of diplomatic leverage and a foundation for long-term prosperity led him to negotiate trade agreements that were integrated with marriage alliances, creating comprehensive relationships that served multiple purposes simultaneously. The cultural impact of these diplomatic initiatives extended far beyond their immediate political and economic benefits, for they facilitated an unprecedented level of cultural exchange between the Rus realm and the rest of Europe. The movement of people, ideas, and artistic influences that accompanied each marriage alliance enriched the cultural life of all participating courts while also spreading awareness of Rus achievements in architecture, literature, and religious art. The reputation of Kyiv as a center of learning and artistic excellence, established initially through Yaroslav's domestic cultural policies, was reinforced and extended through these international connections. The religious dimensions of Yaroslav's diplomatic strategy required particularly careful attention, for the ecclesiastical differences between Orthodox and Latin Christianity created potential obstacles to marriage alliances with Western European powers. The Grand Prince's approach to these challenges demonstrated both theological sophistication and political pragmatism, as he sought to maintain the Orthodox identity of his realm while also establishing working relationships with Latin Christian monarchs. The development of diplomatic protocols that acknowledged religious differences without allowing them to become barriers to political cooperation represented one of the most innovative aspects of Yaroslav's international relations. The negotiations with the Byzantine Empire during this period revealed both the opportunities and the limitations inherent in Yaroslav's diplomatic position. The traditional relationship between Kyiv and Constantinople was based on religious unity and cultural affinity, but it was also characterized by an implicit assumption of Byzantine superiority that Yaroslav was no longer willing to accept uncritically. The Grand Prince's growing network of Western alliances provided him with alternative sources of support and legitimacy that enabled him to negotiate with the Byzantine emperor from a position of greater strength and independence than his predecessors had enjoyed. The marriage of Yaroslav's son Vsevolod to a Byzantine princess represented the culmination of these negotiations and demonstrated the empire's recognition of the Rus realm as an equal partner rather than a subordinate ally. The elaborate ceremonies surrounding this marriage, conducted in both Kyiv and Constantinople, symbolized the evolution of the relationship between the two Orthodox powers while also providing opportunities for cultural and intellectual exchange that benefited both courts. The princess's arrival in Kyiv brought with her not only personal luxury goods but also manuscripts, artistic works, and technical knowledge that contributed to the continued cultural development of the Rus realm. The diplomatic correspondence that flowed between Yaroslav's court and the various European capitals connected to it through marriage alliances provides remarkable insight into the sophisticated understanding of international relations that characterized 11th century monarchy. These letters, written in multiple languages and addressing a wide range of political, commercial, and personal topics, demonstrate the prince's personal involvement in maintaining the relationships that formed the foundation of his diplomatic strategy. The tone and content of this correspondence reveal Yaroslav as a thoughtful and well-informed observer of European politics, whose advice was sought and valued by his royal contemporaries. The intelligence networks that supported these diplomatic initiatives represented one of the most sophisticated information-gathering systems of the medieval period. Yaroslav's agents operated throughout Europe, maintaining contact with court officials, merchants, and religious leaders who could provide current information about political developments that might affect the Grand Prince's interests. This intelligence was systematically collected, analyzed, and used to inform diplomatic strategies that often anticipated and shaped political developments rather than simply reacting to them. The effectiveness of these intelligence operations contributed significantly to the reputation for wisdom and foresight that made Yaroslav such a sought-after ally and advisor. The economic resources required to support this extensive diplomatic activity demonstrated both the prosperity that Yaroslav's domestic policies had generated and the priority that he assigned to international relations. The maintenance of embassies in distant capitals, the transportation of marriage parties across vast distances, and the exchange of expensive gifts that characterized medieval diplomacy all required substantial financial resources that could only be sustained by a realm enjoying considerable economic success. The prince's willingness to invest heavily in diplomatic initiatives reflected his understanding of international relations as a crucial foundation for long-term security and prosperity. The cultural sophistication of Yaroslav's court, developed through his domestic educational and artistic policies, proved to be one of his most valuable diplomatic assets. Foreign envoys visiting Kyiv were consistently impressed by the libraries, schools, and artistic workshops that they encountered, while the educated and articulate courtiers who represented the Grand Prince in foreign capitals enhanced his reputation for wisdom and cultural achievement. This cultural diplomacy complemented and reinforced the formal political relationships established through marriage alliances, creating multiple channels of communication and influence that strengthened the overall diplomatic position of the Rus realm. The coordination of multiple simultaneous diplomatic initiatives required administrative capabilities that reflected the broader institutional development that had occurred under Yaroslav's leadership. The prince's court developed specialized procedures for managing the complex logistics of international relations, from the preparation of diplomatic correspondence to the organization of elaborate ceremonial events that honored visiting dignitaries. These administrative innovations provided models for governmental efficiency that influenced domestic policy development while also demonstrating to foreign observers the sophisticated organizational capabilities of the Rus state. The psychological impact of these diplomatic successes on both domestic and international audiences was profound and lasting. Within the Rus realm, the knowledge that their prince was recognized as an equal by the greatest monarchs of Europe enhanced popular support for his authority, while also creating a sense of national pride that transcended regional and tribal loyalties. Among foreign observers, the transformation of Kyiv from a relatively unknown principality into a major diplomatic power commanded respect and attention that opened doors for future initiatives and opportunities. The timing of these diplomatic initiatives reflected Yaroslav's strategic understanding of the political cycles that governed European international relations. The prince's agents monitored succession disputes, military conflicts, and other political developments that might create opportunities for advantageous alliances or interventions. The careful sequencing of marriage negotiations and other diplomatic initiatives demonstrated sophisticated planning that took into account not only immediate political circumstances but also longer-term trends and possibilities that might affect the strategic position of the Rus realm. As the 1040s progressed and Yaroslav's reputation as the father-in-law of Europe became established, his court became a destination for diplomatic missions from across the continent. Kings and princes who had previously regarded the Rus realm as a distant and exotic territory now sent regular embassies to Kyiv, seeking the Grand Prince's advice on political matters and his support for various international initiatives. This transformation in diplomatic status represented one of the most remarkable political achievements of the medieval period and demonstrated the potential for skilled leadership to elevate a relatively peripheral power to a position of central importance in international affairs. The legacy of these diplomatic initiatives extended far beyond Yaroslav's own lifetime. For the marriage alliances he negotiated created ongoing relationships between the Rus dynasty and European royal families that influenced political developments for centuries to come. The children and grandchildren of these international marriages carried with them both the blood of the Rus princes and the cultural influences of their adopted courts, creating networks of kinship and cultural affinity that transcended immediate political boundaries. The diplomatic revolution that Yaroslav accomplished through patient negotiation and strategic vision transformed not only the international position of his own realm, but also the broader structure of European politics in ways that would endure long after the prince himself had passed from the scene. But as Yaroslav entered the final phase of his remarkable reign, his thoughts turned increasingly toward the challenge of ensuring that his achievements would survive his own mortality. He sent daughters, not armies, and the world listened. But now the time was approaching when he would need to prepare his successors to continue the work he had begun. Phase 5. Legacy and the Eternal Rest, 1050 to 1054 and beyond. In the quiet chambers of the palace at Kyiv, as the golden light of autumn filtered through windows glazed with precious Byzantine glass, Yaroslav the Wise contemplated the weight of years and the burden of legacy. The year was 1052, and the Grand Prince, now in his 74th year, had begun to feel the inevitable approach of that final journey that awaits all mortals, regardless of their earthly achievements. Yet there was no fear in his contemplation, only the deep satisfaction of a man who had transformed not merely a kingdom but the very conception of what wise leadership might accomplish in a world too often governed by the sword rather than the scroll. The physical changes that age had wrought upon the once vigorous prince were evident to all who knew him, yet they seemed somehow appropriate to the gravitas that had always characterized his approach to governance. His hair, once the color of autumn wheat, had long since turned the silver white of winter snow, while his face bore the lines that come not from weakness but from decades of careful thought and measured decision. His hands, which had once gripped sword hilts with deadly precision, now moved more slowly as they turned the pages of the countless manuscripts that filled his private study, but they had lost none of their sure touch when it came to guiding the pen that shaped laws and letters to distant courts. The routine of these later years had settled into patterns that reflected both the accumulated wisdom of long experience and the natural slowing that comes with advanced age. Each morning, the Grand Prince would rise before dawn to attend private prayers in the small chapel adjacent to his chambers, where he would spend long minutes in silent communion with the divine power that he had always recognized as the ultimate source of his earthly authority. These moments of spiritual reflection had become increasingly precious to him as the years passed, for they provided not only comfort and guidance but also the perspective necessary to evaluate his life's work against the eternal standards that would ultimately judge all human achievement. Following his private devotions, Yaroslav would typically spend the early hours of the day in his study, surrounded by the books and documents that had been the tools of his intellectual transformation of the Rus realm. The morning light, streaming through the carefully positioned windows that had been designed to provide optimal illumination for reading and writing, would reveal the prince bent over chronicles and legal texts, his attention focused with the same intensity that had once characterized his preparation for battle. But now the battles were fought with ideas and precedents rather than swords and shields, and the victories were measured in terms of justice preserved and wisdom transmitted rather than enemies defeated and territories conquered. The administrative responsibilities that had once consumed the greater part of each day had been gradually delegated to the capable hands of ministers and advisors who had been trained in the sophisticated governmental techniques that Yaroslav had developed over decades of rule. This delegation was not a sign of weakness or declining capability, but rather a conscious preparation for the transition that would inevitably follow his death. The prince understood that the survival of his achievements would depend not on the continued presence of any individual, no matter how capable, but on the institutional frameworks and cultural traditions that could perpetuate themselves across generations of changing leadership. The visitors who came to pay their respects during these final years found a ruler whose physical presence might have diminished but whose intellectual acuity and moral authority remained undiminished. Foreign ambassadors still sought audiences with the Grand Prince, recognizing that his advice on complex political matters carried weight throughout the courts of Europe. His reputation for wisdom had become so well established that kings and princes would delay important decisions until they could consult with the sage of Kyiv, whose understanding of human nature and political dynamics had been refined through decades of successful governance. The conversations that took place during these audiences revealed a mind that had lost none of its analytical sharpness despite the passage of years. Yaroslav's questions probed to the heart of political problems with the same precision that had once characterized his military strategies, while his advice reflected not only immediate practical considerations but also the longer-term consequences that less experienced rulers might overlook. The diplomatic correspondence of this period shows that his influence on European politics remained substantial even as his direct involvement in day-to-day governance began to diminish. The cultural projects that had always been close to Yaroslav's heart continued to flourish under his patronage, though his personal involvement necessarily became less intensive as his energy waned. The scriptoriums attached to St. Sophia Cathedral and other major churches continued to produce manuscripts that preserved and transmitted the literary heritage of both the Rus realm and the broader Orthodox world. The schools that had been established under his direction had begun to produce their own teachers and scholars, creating a self-sustaining educational system that no longer depended entirely on royal support and oversight. The legal reforms that had been initiated with the compilation of the Russkaya Pravda continued to evolve through the practical experience of judges and administrators who applied its principles to the complex disputes that arose in a rapidly developing society. The prince took particular satisfaction in reports that reached him about the fair and consistent application of legal standards that he had worked so hard to establish, for these accounts suggested that the rule of law was becoming internalized within the governmental system rather than remaining dependent on the personal intervention of the monarch. The architectural projects that had transformed Kyiv from a provincial capital into one of Europe's most magnificent cities had largely been completed, and Yaroslav could look with pride upon the skyline that his vision and resources had created. The golden domes of St. Sophia caught the light of each sunrise and sunset, serving as both a symbol of the realm's prosperity and a reminder of the spiritual foundations upon which all earthly achievement must ultimately rest. The schools, libraries, and workshops that surrounded the great cathedral continued to bustle with activity, demonstrating that the cultural renaissance initiated under his patronage had achieved the self-sustaining momentum that he had always hoped to create. The succession planning that occupied much of Yaroslav's attention during these final years reflected his determination that the realm should not suffer the kind of destructive civil war that had followed his father's death. The traditional system of dividing territories among multiple heirs had obvious advantages in terms of providing opportunities for all members of the royal family, but it also contained the seeds of future conflict as ambitious princes inevitably sought to expand their holdings at the expense of their relatives. Yaroslav's approach to this challenge demonstrated the same careful attention to both immediate practicalities and long-term consequences that had characterized all his major policy initiatives. The detailed testament that the prince prepared during his final years represented one of the most sophisticated attempts at succession planning in medieval European history. Rather than simply dividing the realm among his sons according to traditional patterns, Yaroslav attempted to create a system that would preserve unity while accommodating the legitimate aspirations of all potential heirs. The document established clear hierarchical relationships among the various principalities while also providing mechanisms for peaceful resolution of disputes that might arise between brothers or their descendants. The personal relationships that Yaroslav cultivated with his sons during these years were characterized by the same blend of affection and instruction that had marked his approach to all aspects of governance. Long conversations in the prince's private study provided opportunities for sharing the practical wisdom that could only come from decades of experience in leadership. These discussions covered not only the technical aspects of administration and diplomacy, but also the moral and philosophical principles that should guide a Christian ruler in making difficult decisions. The letters that passed between the aging Grand Prince and his daughters who had married into royal families across Europe provided another channel for transmitting the wisdom and values that had guided his own reign. These communications, carefully preserved in various court archives, reveal a father who remained deeply concerned with the welfare and success of his children, while also using their positions to advance the broader interests of the Rus realm. The advice and guidance contained in these letters demonstrated the continuing vitality of Yaroslav's political thinking even as his direct involvement in day-to-day governance diminished. The religious devotions that had always been an important part of Yaroslav's daily routine became increasingly central to his life as he aged and began to contemplate his own mortality. The prince had always understood the relationship between earthly authority and divine mandate, but the approach of death seemed to deepen his appreciation for the temporary nature of all human achievement and the eternal significance of spiritual preparation. The theological discussions that took place in his private chambers during these years revealed a mind grappling seriously with questions about the meaning and purpose of human existence. The charitable activities that had characterized Yaroslav's reign throughout its duration continued and even intensified during his final years, as the prince sought to ensure that his legacy would include not only political and cultural achievements but also tangible improvements in the lives of the poorest and most vulnerable members of society. Generous donations to religious institutions provided ongoing support for education and care for the needy, while special provisions in his testament established endowments that would continue these activities after his death. The international recognition that Yaroslav received during his final years provided satisfying confirmation that his efforts to establish the Rus realm as a major European power had achieved lasting success. Diplomatic correspondence from courts across the continent continued to seek his advice and support, while the marriages he had arranged for his children continued to yield political and economic benefits for his realm. The transformation of Kyiv from a relatively obscure principality into a capital that commanded respect from Paris to Constantinople represented one of the most remarkable diplomatic achievements of the medieval period. As the winter of 1053 settled over Kyiv, bringing with it the kind of deep cold that seemed to penetrate even the best heated chambers of the royal palace, those closest to Yaroslav began to notice the subtle signs that suggested his earthly journey was approaching its end. The prince's appetite diminished, and his legendary energy seemed to ebb like a tide gradually withdrawing from a familiar shore. Yet his mind remained clear and his interest in the affairs of the realm undiminished, as if he were determined to remain fully engaged with the responsibilities of leadership until the very moment when divine providence called him to lay down those burdens forever. The spring of 1054 brought renewed life to the forests and fields surrounding Kyiv, but it was clear to all who knew him that the Grand Prince would not see another such season of renewal. The chronic weakness that had afflicted him throughout the winter months gradually worsened, and even his iron will could not entirely compensate for the failing strength of his aging body. Yet there was no panic or desperation in his response to these developments, only the calm acceptance of a man who had lived a full and productive life, and who faced the future with the confidence that comes from a clear conscience and a job well done. The final days of Yaroslav's life were spent in the familiar surroundings of his palace chambers, surrounded by family members and trusted advisors who had shared the journey of his remarkable reign. The conversations during these last days often turned to memories of the great events and achievements that had marked his rule, from the desperate civil war that had brought him to power to the diplomatic triumphs that had established his realm among the great powers of Europe. But there was no boasting or self-congratulation in these reminiscences, only the quiet satisfaction of a man reviewing a life lived according to principles that had stood the test of time. On February 20th, 1054, as the first hints of spring began to stir in the frozen earth around Kyiv, Yaroslav the Wise breathed his last, surrounded by those who had loved and served him throughout his long and productive life. The death was peaceful, marked by none of the drama or violence that had characterized so many medieval royal deaths, but rather by the same dignity and calm that had marked all his major decisions throughout his reign. In his final moments, the prince's thoughts seemed to turn toward the great cathedral of St. Sophia, where his mortal remains would rest while his spirit joined the eternal community of those who had served God faithfully during their earthly sojourns. The news of Yaroslav's death spread slowly across the vast expanse of the Rus realm and beyond, carried by the same networks of communication that had served his diplomatic initiatives during his lifetime. In Kyiv, the immediate response was one of profound grief mixed with gratitude for the long and prosperous reign that had brought unprecedented peace and prosperity to the land. The elaborate funeral ceremonies that followed reflected both the Christian beliefs that had guided the prince's life and the royal dignity that his achievements had earned for the realm he had served so faithfully. The procession that carried Yaroslav's body to its final resting place in St. Sophia Cathedral represented a final demonstration of the cultural sophistication and international connections that had characterized his reign. Representatives from courts across Europe joined with local nobles and clergy in a ceremony that honored not only the deceased ruler but also the remarkable transformation that had occurred under his leadership. The cathedral itself, with its soaring domes and magnificent decorations, provided a fitting setting for the interment of the man whose vision and resources had made its construction possible. The marble sarcophagus that received Yaroslav's remains had been carved by craftsmen whose skills reflected the artistic renaissance that had flourished under his patronage. The inscriptions, executed in both Church Slavonic and Greek, proclaimed not only his royal titles but also his reputation for wisdom and justice that had made him respected throughout the medieval world. The location of the tomb, within the cathedral that had served as the symbolic center of his cultural and religious achievements, ensured that future generations would remember not only his political accomplishments but also his contribution to the spiritual and intellectual life of his people. The immediate aftermath of Yaroslav's death demonstrated both the effectiveness of his succession planning and the fundamental stability that his long reign had brought to the Rus realm. The transition of power to his designated heirs proceeded smoothly, without the violent conflicts that had marked previous successions and that would plague later periods of Rus history. The institutional frameworks that he had established continued to function effectively, while the diplomatic relationships he had cultivated provided ongoing benefits for his successors. The international reaction to Yaroslav's death provided a final testament to the transformation he had accomplished in the status of the Rus realm within European politics. Courts from France to Byzantium sent formal condolences and expressions of respect for the deceased monarch, while several foreign rulers attended memorial services in their own capitals. The diplomatic correspondence of the period reveals the genuine affection and respect that Yaroslav had earned among his royal contemporaries, who recognized in him a fellow monarch of exceptional wisdom and ability. The cultural legacy that Yaroslav left behind proved to be even more enduring than his political achievements. The schools and libraries he had established continued to flourish for centuries, preserving and transmitting the literary and intellectual heritage of the Orthodox Slavic world. The legal principles embodied in the Russkaya Pravda influenced jurisprudence throughout the region for generations to come, while the architectural monuments he had commissioned continued to inspire builders and artists long after his death. The historical reputation that Yaroslav acquired in the generations following his death reflected the growing recognition of his unique combination of military prowess, administrative skill, and cultural sophistication. Chronicles written in various courts across Europe consistently portrayed him as one of the greatest rulers of his age, while the epithet the Wise became permanently attached to his name as a recognition of the intellectual qualities that had distinguished his approach to governance. The long-term impact of Yaroslav's reign on the development of Eastern European civilization cannot be overstated. His success in creating stable governmental institutions and promoting cultural development established patterns and precedents that influenced political development in the region for centuries to come. The diplomatic relationships he established between the Rus realm and Western Europe helped to integrate Eastern Slavic lands into the broader European community, while his promotion of Orthodox Christianity and Slavic culture provided foundations for distinct national identities that endure to this day. The peaceful nature of Yaroslav's death and the calm dignity of his funeral provided a fitting conclusion to a reign that had been characterized more by thoughtful planning and patient development than by dramatic gestures or spectacular conquests. In an age when most medieval rulers were remembered primarily for their military exploits, Yaroslav created a different kind of legacy based on wisdom, justice, and cultural achievement. His understanding that true greatness lay not in the territory conquered, but in the institutions created and the knowledge preserved ensured that his influence would extend far beyond the boundaries of his own lifetime. As the years passed and memory gradually transformed into legend, the figure of Yaroslav the Wise came to represent an ideal of enlightened monarchy that inspired rulers and subjects alike. The vision of a realm governed by law rather than arbitrary will, where learning flourished alongside commerce, and where diplomatic skill could achieve more than military force, provided a model that would be invoked by generations of leaders seeking to justify their own authority and inspire their own achievements. In the stone silence of St. Sophia Cathedral, where golden mosaics caught the light of countless candles and the chanted prayers of priests created an atmosphere of eternal peace, the mortal remains of Yaroslav the Wise found their final rest. But his true monument lay not in any tomb, however magnificent, but in the transformed realm he left behind. A land where justice had replaced arbitrary rule, where learning had taken root in soil once barren of books, and where the name of Kyiv was spoken with respect in courts from Paris to Constantinople. His name faded from lips, but not from stone. In the laws that governed his people, in the marriages that bound his dynasty to the royal houses of Europe, in the schools where young minds learned to read and think, in the cathedral whose domes caught each dawn's light and held it like a prayer made visible. In all these things, Yaroslav the Wise lived on, his legacy as enduring as the faith that had guided his life and as lasting as the wisdom that had earned him a place among the greatest rulers in the long and often troubled history of human civilization. And so, in the deep silence of winter nights, when snow covered the golden domes of Kyiv and the great river ran dark beneath sheets of ice, his spirit seemed to rest peacefully in the knowledge that he had used well the time given to him, that he had built not for glory but for truth, not for conquest but for justice, not for fear but for love. The sword had made him prince, but wisdom had made him eternal.